The acrid smoke from a burning barn stung Grace Wilson's eyes as she watched, helpless, while the crowd's accusations grew louder in the small town of Redwater, Colorado. The year was 1878, and the line between medicine and witchcraft remained dangerously thin for a woman with knowledge of herbs and healing. "She's the one who made the Miller boy sick," shouted Mrs. Tanner, pointing a bony finger at Grace. "I saw her giving him that strange tea right before he took ill." Grace clutched her worn leather satchel tighter against her chest, the precious herbs and tinctures inside representing everything she'd learned from her grandmother. "I was trying to help him," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The fever was already upon him when his mother called for me." Sheriff Holloway stepped between Grace and the growing mob, his weathered face grave beneath his hat. "Now, folks, we ain't going back to the dark ages here. Miss Wilson has helped plenty of you with her remedies." "Then why did 3 cattle die after she walked past the Henderson farm?" demanded a red-faced man from the back. "And why does she pick them herbs under the full moon?" The whispers grew, spinning tales of midnight gatherings and strange lights in Grace's cabin window. At 24, Grace had lived alone since her grandmother passed 2 winters ago, inheriting not just the small cabin at the edge of town, but also the suspicion that had always followed the Wilson women. "I collect the herbs when they're most potent," Grace explained, though she knew reason rarely penetrated fear. "And I've never harmed anyone's livestock." The sheriff sighed heavily. "Miss Wilson, I think it might be best if you leave town for a spell, let things cool down." Grace felt her world crumbling. This was her home, the only place she'd ever known. "Where would I go? My sister runs a boarding house in Ventura about 2 days' ride south. I can arrange passage on tomorrow's stage." His eyes were kind but firm. "It ain't safe for you here right now, Grace." That night, as Grace packed her few belongings by candlelight, she heard the crack of a branch outside her window. Grabbing her father's old revolver, she moved silently to the door, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" she called, raising the gun. A groan answered her, followed by the heavy thud of a body falling against her porch steps. Grace cautiously opened the door, the lamplight revealing a man slumped against the railing. Blood soaked through his shirt at the shoulder, his hat fallen to the ground beside him. "Please," he gasped, looking up at her with pain-glazed eyes the color of a storm-dark sky. "I heard. You can help people." Grace hesitated. Helping this stranger could be the final proof the townsfolk needed to condemn her completely. Yet she couldn't turn away someone in need. It went against everything her grandmother had taught her. "Come inside," she said, tucking the revolver into her apron pocket and helping the man to his feet. He was tall and solidly built, the muscles of a working man evident beneath his bloodied shirt. His dark hair fell across his forehead as he stumbled into her cabin. "Name's Mason Grant," he managed as she helped him to her small bed. "Took a bullet. Dispute over cattle." Grace worked quickly, cutting away his shirt to reveal a nasty wound where the bullet had torn through the flesh of his upper arm. "The bullet passed through, which is fortunate," she murmured, gathering her supplies. "Though you've lost a fair amount of blood." Mason watched her with wary eyes as she mixed herbs in a small bowl, adding water and grinding them to a paste. "They say in town, you're a witch." Grace's hands stilled momentarily before she continued her work. "And yet here you are, seeking my help." A faint smile touched his cracked lips. "Desperate men make interesting choices." His eyes fluttered closed for a moment, then opened with renewed clarity. "Then heal me, witch." The directness of his words made her pause. There was no fear in his voice, only a challenging acceptance. Grace met his gaze steadily. "I am a healer, Mr. Grant, nothing more, nothing less." She began cleaning his wound with a tincture of alcohol and yarrow. "This will sting." Mason hissed between his teeth but remained still as she worked. "How'd a young woman like you learn doctoring? My grandmother taught me." She learned from her mother and so on. Grace applied the poultice to his wound. "The knowledge of plants and their properties has been passed down through generations of Wilson women. And that makes you a witch." Mason asked, watching her bandage his arm with practiced movements. According to the good people of Redwater, a woman with knowledge is dangerous enough. A woman who can heal without a medical degree or a husband to validate her is practically consorting with the devil. Grace tied off the bandage with more force than necessary. Mason studied her face in the lamplight, the determined set of her jaw, the intelligence in her green eyes, the way her auburn hair escaped its pins to curl around her temples. She was not what he'd expected when he'd dragged himself to the witch's cabin on the edge of town. "Where I come from, results speak louder than rumors," he said finally. "If you can keep this arm working, I don't much care what they call you." Grace gave him a bitter smile. "Well, Mr. Grant, you might be the only one. The sheriff has suggested I leave town tomorrow before someone decides to see if I float." Mason's expression darkened. "That bad? Bad enough." Grace moved to her small stove, putting on water for tea. "I need to prepare a willow bark tea for your pain and fever." As she worked, Mason took in the small cabin neat and orderly, with bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, shelves lined with jars of various concoctions, and a small bookshelf filled with worn volumes. It looked nothing like the den of evil the townspeople described in whispers. It reminded him, strangely, of his mother's kitchen back in Texas. "Where will you go?" he asked as she handed him the steaming cup. Grace sat in the wooden chair by the bed, suddenly looking exhausted. "The sheriff mentioned his sister runs a boarding house in Ventura. I'm to take tomorrow's stage." Mason sipped the bitter tea, grimacing at the taste. "Ventura's a decent town, bit more forward-thinking than this place, at least." "You know it. Passed through a few times, got some business there, actually." He hesitated, studying her over the rim of his cup. "I could accompany you, once I'm able to ride, that is." Grace's eyebrows rose. "Why would you do that?" "Let's call it payment for services rendered." He gestured to his bandaged arm. "A lady traveling alone attracts attention, not all of it welcome." "And a lady traveling with a wounded cowboy doesn't?" Grace asked skeptically. Mason's lips quirked. "I clean up well enough, Miss Wilson, and I'm handy with a gun, even with my left hand." Grace considered him thoughtfully. There was something solid about Mason Grant, a steadiness in his gaze that suggested reliability. Still, she'd learned the hard way not to trust too easily. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Grant, but I've managed on my own this far." "Fair enough." He didn't press the issue, which raised him slightly in her estimation. "Mind if I impose on your hospitality for the night, though? Don't think I'd make it back to town just yet." Grace nodded. "You should rest. I'll make a pallet for myself by the fire." As she prepared for the night, Grace was acutely aware of the stranger in her home. It had been a long time since she'd shared space with anyone. Since her grandmother's passing, her solitude had been both a comfort and a burden. "Miss Wilson," Mason's voice came from the bed as she arranged her blankets on the floor. "Thank you. Not everyone would help a stranger bleeding on their doorstep." Grace looked over at him, already half asleep from the pain-relieving tea. "Get some rest, Mr. Grant. We'll see how that arm looks in the morning." The next morning dawned clear and cool. Grace woke early, habit driving her to check on her patient before anything else. Mason was sleeping soundly, his breathing even. When she gently touched his forehead, she was relieved to find no fever. She moved quietly around the cabin, packing her remaining belongings and preparing a simple breakfast of cornbread and honey. The stage would be leaving at 10 o'clock, and she wanted to be ready well before then to avoid as much of the town as possible. The smell of coffee eventually roused Mason. He sat up slowly, wincing as he tested his injured arm. "How's it feeling?" Grace asked, bringing him a cup of coffee. "Like I got shot," he replied with a wry smile, "but better than last night." He accepted the coffee gratefully. "You make a fine nurse, Miss Wilson." "I need to change your bandage before I leave," she said, already gathering fresh cloth and her herbal salve. "The stage departs at 10. Mason watched as she unwrapped his wound with gentle fingers. "This isn't right, you know, running you out of town for helping people." "It's the way of things," Grace replied, inspecting the wound. It looked clean with no signs of infection. "Women who don't conform get labeled, which harlot, troublemaker, still ain't right." Mason's jaw tightened as she applied fresh salve to his wound. "What if you didn't go?" Grace secured the new bandage before answering. "Then eventually someone gets brave enough to act on their fears. Maybe they burn my cabin. Maybe they decide a trial by water is in order." She straightened up, meeting his eyes. "My grandmother always said there are times to stand your ground and times to find new ground to stand on. This is the latter." Mason nodded slowly. "When does the stage leave?" 2 hours from now." "Then I'm coming with you." When she began to protest, he held up his good hand. "I was heading to Ventura anyway. Might as well travel together." Grace hesitated. Having a companion on the journey would be safer, and Mason seemed capable despite his injury. "Can you even ride with that arm?" "I've ridden with worse," he assured her. "My horse is stabled in town." "I can meet you at the stage office." Grace considered her options, then nodded. "Very well, Mr. Grant, but if you're not there by the time the stage leaves, I won't wait." 2 hours later, Grace sat rigid on the hard wooden bench of the stage office, her 2 small trunks beside her. She'd chosen a plain brown traveling dress, her hair tucked neatly under a modest bonnet, trying her best to look unremarkable. Still, she could feel the stares of the other passengers and the stage driver, who kept glancing nervously in her direction. Sheriff Holloway appeared at the door, hat in hand. "Tickets all arranged, Miss Wilson. Driver knows you're coming along." "Thank you, Sheriff," Grace said quietly. "I'm sorry it came to this," he added, lowering his voice. "You've done good for this town, whatever they might say." "Your grandmother would be proud of how you've carried on her work." Grace's throat tightened at the mention of her grandmother. "She always said ignorance and fear make poor neighbors." The sheriff nodded sadly. "Ain't that the truth?" He glanced at the clock on the wall. "Stage leaves in 10 minutes. I'll help get your trunks loaded." Grace's heart sank as she realized Mason wasn't coming. She'd half expected it, but still felt a twinge of disappointment. She rose to follow the sheriff outside when the door swung open again. Mason Grant stood there, dressed in clean clothes, his injured arm supported by a makeshift sling beneath his coat. He'd shaved and combed his hair, and without the grime and blood of the previous night, Grace could see he was handsome in a rugged, weathered way. "Almost thought you weren't coming," she said as he approached. "Had to convince the stable boy to saddle my horse with minimal help," he replied. He wasn't keen on assisting the man who'd been seen heading to the witch's cabin. His smile took any sting from the words. Sheriff Holloway looked between them, eyebrows raised. "You two acquainted?" "Mr. Grant required some medical attention last night," Grace explained carefully. "He's also traveling to Ventura." The sheriff studied Mason with a lawman's practiced eye. "Any reason I should know about that wound, Grant?" "Hunting accident," Mason replied smoothly. "Nothing that concerns the law." The sheriff didn't look convinced, but he let it drop. "Well, you'll be out of my jurisdiction soon enough anyway." He tipped his hat to Grace. "Safe travels, Miss Wilson. My sister's expecting you." Mrs. Helen Forrester runs the Willow Creek boarding house on Pine Street. The stage driver called for boarding, and Grace felt a surge of emotion as she realized this was truly happening. She was leaving the only home she'd ever known with little hope of return. "Miss Wilson," Mason extended his good arm to help her into the stage. "Shall we?" As the stage pulled away from Redwater, Grace watched through the window as her hometown receded into the distance. The other passengers, a traveling salesman and an older couple, kept their distance, having heard the whispers about the witch joining their journey. Grace was used to such treatment and busied herself with a small book of botanical drawings. Mason sat beside her, his tall frame too large for the cramped confines of the stage. His knee occasionally brushed against hers as the coach bounced over the rough road. "Where in Texas are you from, Mr. Grant?" Grace asked after they had traveled in silence for nearly an hour. Mason glanced at her, surprised. "How'd you know I was from Texas? Your accent has a distinctive quality, and you mentioned back in Texas last night," his lips curved in appreciation. "Good ear. I'm from a small place outside of San Antonio originally, though I haven't called it home in years." "What brings you to Colorado?" Grace asked, genuinely curious about her traveling companion. Mason shifted, adjusting his position to ease his injured arm. "Cattle mostly. I move herds for various ranchers, take odd jobs between drives." He didn't elaborate further, and Grace sensed there was more to his story than he was willing to share. "And your business in Ventura, meeting a man about a job." Mason turned the conversation back to her. "Have you ever been outside of Redwater before?" Grace shook her head. "My grandmother believed in putting down roots. The Wilson women have lived in that cabin for 3 generations. Must be hard to leave it behind." Grace traced the edge of her book with her finger. "It is, but the plants I need grow elsewhere too. My knowledge isn't tied to that land." The stage hit a particularly deep rut, jolting everyone inside. Mason winced as the movement jarred his wounded arm. "Let me check your bandage," Grace offered quietly. The older woman across from them made a small sound of alarm. "Perhaps that's not appropriate, young lady." Grace turned to her with a calm smile. "I'm a healer, madam. Mr. Grant has an injury that requires attention." "She's the witch they were talking about in town," the woman's husband muttered to her, not quite under his breath. Mason's eyes hardened. "Miss Wilson is a skilled medical practitioner who saved my arm, possibly my life. I'd appreciate it if you'd show her the respect she deserves." The couple fell silent, though they pressed themselves further into their corner of the coach. Grace felt a rush of gratitude toward Mason for his defense. "The bandage can wait until our next stop," she said, touched by his intervention. Mason nodded, but kept a protective position beside her for the remainder of the afternoon. When the stage stopped at a way station for the night, he made sure to stay close as they entered the small, rustic inn that served travelers on the route. The innkeeper's wife showed them to the common dining room, where a simple meal of stew and biscuits awaited the stage passengers. Grace was acutely aware of the whispered conversations that followed their entrance. News traveled fast along the stage routes, and it seemed her reputation had preceded her. "Pay them no mind," Mason said softly as they took seats at the far end of the table. "People fear what they don't understand." "And you understand?" Grace asked, breaking a biscuit in half. Mason considered her question seriously. "My mother had a way with healing. Nothing as extensive as what you do, but she could set bones, deliver babies, brew remedies for common ailments. Where I grew up, such skills were valued, not feared. Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was." A shadow crossed his face. "She died when I was 16, cholera outbreak." "I'm sorry," Grace said, recognizing the familiar pain of loss in his expression. "It was a long time ago." Mason changed the subject. "How's your stew?" They ate in companionable silence, both aware of the occasional glances from other diners. After the meal, Grace retrieved her medical supplies from her trunk to properly check Mason's wound in the relative privacy of a corner of the inn's front porch. "It's healing well," she noted as she inspected the injury in the fading daylight. "No signs of infection." "Thanks to your witchcraft," Mason said with a teasing smile. Grace rolled her eyes. "Elderberry, yarrow, and clean bandages hardly constitute witchcraft. To most folks around here, a woman knowing more than a man is supernatural enough." Mason watched as she applied fresh salve to his wound. "Where did you learn all this?" "Just from your grandmother, partly. She taught me the basics from the time I was little." Grace worked as she spoke, her movements practiced and efficient. But she also had books, journals passed down through generations, medical texts she traded for, even notes from a physician who spent a winter in Redwater when I was a child. "You can read Latin?" Mason asked, noticing a phrase she'd murmured while working. Grace smiled slightly. "Some. Enough to decipher the old medical texts. My grandmother insisted on education, even for a girl in a small mining town." "A dangerous woman indeed," Mason said, his eyes warm with admiration rather than suspicion. When she finished rebandaging his arm, Grace found herself reluctant to break the moment of connection between them. Mason seemed to feel it too, his hand lingering near hers as she packed away her supplies. "We should get some rest," she said finally. "The stage leaves at dawn." Mason nodded. "I'll see you safely to your room." The innkeeper had given Grace a small private room, a luxury afforded to her as the only unaccompanied woman in the party. Mason walked her to the door, standing protectively nearby as she unlocked it. "Thank you," Grace said, "for your companionship today. It made the journey easier." "My pleasure, Miss Wilson." He hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, I think Redwater's loss will be Ventura's gain." Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. "Good night, Mr. Grant." "Good night, Miss Wilson." He tipped his hat and waited until she closed and locked her door before walking away. Alone in her small room, Grace sat on the edge of the bed, allowing herself to feel the full weight of the day's events. She had left behind everything familiar: her home, her garden, the graves of her family. Ahead lay uncertainty, a new town that might prove just as hostile once they discovered her abilities. Yet as she prepared for bed, Grace found herself thinking not of what she had lost, but of the unexpected ally she had found in Mason Grant. For the first time since the accusations began, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope for what might lie ahead. The journey to Ventura took another full day of travel. As the stage rolled through increasingly mountainous terrain, Grace found herself fascinated by the changing landscape and vegetation. She occasionally pointed out medicinal plants she recognized growing alongside the trail, explaining their properties to Mason, who listened with genuine interest. "That purple flower there," she said, indicating a patch of wildflowers as they passed, "can be used to make a tincture for headaches. And those berries, though they look tempting, would cause severe stomach distress if eaten." "Useful knowledge for a traveler," Mason commented. "How do you keep track of it all?" Grace patted her leather-bound journal. "I document everything. Drawings, properties, preparation methods. My grandmother taught me that memory is fallible, but written knowledge endures." By late afternoon, the stage began its descent into a valley where the town of Ventura sprawled along a river. Unlike the rough mining settlement of Redwater, Ventura showed signs of prosperity and permanence: painted buildings, proper streets, even a small church steeple rising above the town center. "Cattle country," Mason explained as they approached. The railroad came through 5 years ago, making it an important shipping point for herds from the surrounding ranches. Grace felt a flutter of anxiety as the stage rolled down the main street. "Do you think they'll be more accepting here?" Mason considered her question. "Ventura's grown fast. Lots of new folks coming through, which tends to make people more tolerant of differences." He gave her an encouraging smile. "Besides, a good healer is welcome anywhere there's people getting sick or hurt, which is everywhere I've ever been." The stage came to a stop outside the Ventura Hotel, which also served as the stage office. Mason helped Grace down from the coach, then secured the assistance of a local boy to transport her trunks to the Willow Creek boarding house. The boarding house proved to be a tidy 2-story structure painted a cheerful yellow, with white trim and a well-tended garden. Helen Forrester, the sheriff's sister, greeted them at the door, a plump, energetic woman with graying hair and kind eyes that reminded Grace of her brother's. "You must be Grace Wilson," she said warmly. "My brother wrote ahead about you, said you're handy with herbs and healing." She ushered them inside, directing the boy with the trunks toward a room on the ground floor. "I've given you the garden room, figured you'd appreciate being close to the plants." "That's very thoughtful," Grace said, pleasantly surprised by the welcome. Helen turned her attention to Mason. "And you are Mason Grant, madam. I accompanied Miss Wilson from Redwater." Helen's eyes narrowed slightly as she took in his injured arm and travel-worn appearance. "You'll be needing a room as well, just for a night or two until I settle my business in town," Mason confirmed. Helen nodded briskly. "Got one available on the 2nd floor, $2 a night, meals included." She turned back to Grace. Your brother arranged 3 weeks' board for you, Miss Wilson. Should give you time to get established. Grace felt a rush of gratitude toward Sheriff Holloway. That's most generous. He mentioned some nonsense about trouble in Redwater, Helen continued, lowering her voice. Said folks were being foolish about your healing ways. Grace tensed, waiting for the inevitable suspicion to cloud Helen's face. Instead, the older woman snorted dismissively. People can be such fools. When my Thomas took sick with pneumonia last winter, you think I cared whether the doctor used fancy medical school learning or old country knowledge? All that mattered was that he got better. She patted Grace's hand. You'll find Ventura more practical-minded, I think. Relief washed over Grace. I hope so, Mrs. Forrester. Call me Helen. Now, you two must be tired and hungry after your journey. Dinner's at 6 gives you time to freshen up. After Helen departed to prepare the evening meal, Mason helped Grace carry her smaller belongings into her room. It was simple but comfortable, with a window overlooking a well-tended herb garden. Seems promising, Mason observed, setting down her medicine case. Grace moved to the window, looking out at the neat rows of herbs. Yes, it does. She turned back to him. What about your business here? Will you start on that tomorrow? Mason nodded. Need to meet with a rancher named Hargrove about a cattle drive to Wyoming. Shouldn't take more than a day or two to finalize arrangements. An awkward silence fell between them. Their journey together was ending, yet Grace felt strangely reluctant to part ways with this man who had shown her kindness when she needed it most. I should thank you, she said finally, for your protection during our journey. No thanks needed. Mason hesitated, then added, I'd like to check in on you before I leave town. Make sure you're settling in all right. Grace felt a surprising flutter in her chest at his words. I'd like that. Mason's smile deepened the lines around his eyes in a way that Grace found unexpectedly appealing. Then I'll see you at dinner, Miss Wilson. Dinner at the boarding house introduced Grace to the other residents. Mr. Chambers, an elderly bookkeeper who worked at the bank, the Dawson sisters, 2 middle-aged seamstresses who shared a room, and Mr. Peterson, a quiet man who worked for the railroad. Helen's husband Thomas, a burly former blacksmith now partially retired due to his respiratory issues, presided over the table with jovial authority. To Grace's relief, the conversation remained pleasant and general. When Helen mentioned that Grace was knowledgeable about herbal remedies, Thomas immediately perked up. That's so. My lungs give me trouble since that pneumonia. Doctor's powders help some, but not enough. I might be able to prepare something for you, Grace offered cautiously. If you're interested, I'd be grateful, Thomas exclaimed. Been hard not being able to work a full day. Helen beamed at Grace. See, already making yourself useful. After dinner, Mason found Grace in the small sitting room where she was examining the herbs in Helen's garden by the last light of day. Settling in? He asked, joining her by the window. Better than I expected, Grace admitted. Helen seems accepting of my skills and her husband is eager for help with his breathing troubles. Good. Mason leaned against the windowsill. Hargrove's ranch is about 10 miles outside of town. I'll ride out tomorrow to meet with him. Grace nodded, trying to ignore the disappointment she felt at the thought of his departure. How long will this cattle drive take? 6 weeks, give or take, moving 3,000 head to the railhead in Wyoming. Mason studied her face in the fading light. Would it be too forward to ask if I might write to you while I'm gone? I'd be interested to hear how you're faring in Ventura. Grace felt a blush rise to her cheeks. I would like that, very much. Mason's expression softened. Then I'll make sure to do so. He straightened up from the window. I should let you rest. It's been a long journey. Yes, it has. Grace hesitated, then added, I'd like to check your wound once more before you leave for the ranch tomorrow to ensure it's healing properly. I'd appreciate that, Mason said. Good night, Miss Wilson. Good night, Mr. Grant. In the days that followed Mason's departure for the Hargrove Ranch, Grace settled into life in Ventura. Helen introduced her to several townspeople as a talented healer from back east. tactfully omitting any mention of the circumstances that had brought her to town. To Grace's surprise, most people seemed more curious than suspicious about her knowledge of herbal remedies. She began by treating Thomas Forrester's respiratory issues with a mixture of mullein, elecampane, and honey. When his breathing noticeably improved within days, Helen spread the word to her friends and acquaintances. Soon, Grace found herself with a small but growing number of people seeking her assistance for various ailments. Dr. Phillips, the town's only physician, initially regarded her with professional suspicion. But after encountering her at the bedside of Mrs. Lowell, whose childbirth fever had resisted his treatments, he grudgingly acknowledged the effectiveness of Grace's herbal knowledge. "Where did you study?" he asked her as they left the Lowell home together, the new mother resting comfortably after Grace's willow bark and elderflower tea had reduced her fever. "I didn't formally," Grace admitted. "My grandmother taught me, and I've studied from whatever medical texts I could obtain." Dr. Phillips frowned. "Unorthodox, but I cannot argue with results." He hesitated, then added stiffly, "Mrs. Lowell would likely have died without your intervention. I appreciate your assistance." It was far from a warm embrace of her methods, but it represented a professional acknowledgement that Grace had never received in Redwater. The doctor even began referring certain cases to her, particularly women's complaints and chronic conditions that his more conventional treatments couldn't adequately address. 2 weeks after arriving in Ventura, Grace received her first letter from Mason. Helen delivered it with a knowing smile that made Grace blush as she retreated to her room to read it privately. Mason's handwriting was surprisingly neat, and even the letter itself straightforward but thoughtful. He described the cattle drive preparations, mentioned the improving condition of his arm, and inquired about her adjustment to Ventura. The final paragraph warmed her heart more than she wanted to admit. "I find myself thinking of our conversations on the stage more often than I expected. Your knowledge and passion for healing is something rare in this world. I hope Ventura is wise enough to recognize the gift they've been given in your arrival. I expect to return to town in approximately 7 weeks and would very much like to call on you then, if agreeable." Grace read the letter 3 times before carefully folding it and placing it in her journal. She composed a reply that evening, describing her growing practice and the cautious acceptance she'd found in Ventura. She concluded with a simple but sincere statement that she would welcome his visit upon his return. As spring warmed into summer, Grace's reputation in Ventura continued to improve. She established a small treatment room in an unused pantry at the boarding house, where Helen allowed her to see patients for a modest share of her earnings. She cultivated medicinal herbs in the garden, expanding the existing beds with Helen's enthusiastic permission. Not everyone was welcoming, of course. Pastor Wallace from the local church regarded her with open suspicion, particularly after his wife sought Grace's help for her female complaints rather than suffering in silence as he preferred. A few of the more conservative townspeople whispered about unnatural knowledge and women overstepping their place. But such sentiments remained minority views. Grace exchanged letters with Mason every 2 weeks, their correspondence becoming gradually more personal. He shared stories of his childhood in Texas, his years working cattle drives across the West, and his dream of someday having land of his own. Grace found herself revealing more of her own history, the loss of her parents to influenza when she was a child, her grandmother's teachings, and her hopes of eventually opening a proper apothecary shop. 5 weeks after Mason's departure, disaster struck the cattle drive. Grace received an urgent message from the Hargrove Ranch requesting her immediate presence. 3 cowboys had been seriously injured when a lightning strike spooked the herd, causing a small stampede. Dr. Phillips was away attending a medical conference in Denver, and the ranch foreman had heard of Grace's healing skills. Helen's husband Thomas insisted on driving Grace to the ranch himself. "No sense in you traveling alone," he said as he hitched the wagon. "Besides, my breathing's better than it's been in years, thanks to your remedies." The Hargrove Ranch was an impressive spread, with a large main house and several outbuildings spread across the valley. Ranch hands directed them to the bunkhouse, where the injured men were being tended. Grace's heart leaped when she saw Mason among the caretakers, his shirt sleeve rolled up to reveal her faded bandage still wrapped around his healing arm. He looked up as she entered, relief evident in his expression. "Grace," he said, momentarily forgetting formality. "Thank God you've come." She quickly assessed the situation. One man had a broken leg, another suffered from severe burns, and the third had been trampled with possible internal injuries. Grace set to work immediately, directing Mason and the other ranch hands to assist her. For hours, she worked tirelessly, setting the broken leg, treating the burns with a soothing salve, and carefully examining the trampled man for signs of internal bleeding. By evening, all 3 patients were stabilized, though the man with internal injuries remained in serious condition. "You should rest," Mason told her as she washed blood from her hands in a basin. "You've been working non-stop since you arrived." Grace shook her head. "I need to monitor Josiah through the night. Internal injuries can turn critical quickly. Then at least eat something." Mason guided her to a chair and brought her a plate of stew from the cookhouse. "The men are calling you an angel," he said quietly as he sat beside her. "Even old Peterson, who's never said a kind word about anyone in the 15 years I've known him." Grace managed a tired smile. "I'm just doing what I was taught to do, which is exactly what makes you remarkable." Mason's eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Most people run from suffering. You walk straight toward it with open hands." "Mr. Grant," she began, suddenly uncertain how to respond to the admiration in his gaze. "Mason," he corrected gently. "After all we've shared in our letters, I think we've earned the right to first names, don't you?" Grace nodded. "Mason, then." They sat in comfortable silence as Grace ate, the bunkhouse quiet except for the occasional pained murmur from the injured men. When she finished, Mason took her plate. "I'll stay with you tonight," he said. "Help you watch over Josiah." "The cattle," Grace began. "The other men have it handled. Mr. Hargrove himself ordered me to assist you however needed." Mason smiled slightly. "Seems he values his men more than his schedule." Through the night, they took turns monitoring the injured cowboys. During the quiet hours between checks, they talked in low voices, their conversation continuing the intimacy that had developed through their letters. In person, Grace found Mason even more thoughtful and genuine than his written words had suggested. "Why cattle driving?" she asked him as dawn approached. "It seems a hard life." Mason considered the question. "Freedom, I suppose. After my mother died, my father remarried quickly. His new wife had different ideas about family." The pain in his voice suggested more than he was saying. "By 16, I was looking for any way to make my own path. A cattle drive was hiring and I was strong enough for the work. And now, after all these years," Mason's expression turned reflective. "Now I'm looking to put down roots. Mr. Hargrove has offered me a position as his foreman after this drive. It would mean staying in one place, managing the ranch operations rather than constantly moving with the herds. Are you going to accept?" Grace asked, trying to keep her voice casual despite the sudden acceleration of her heart. "I'm considering it," Mason replied, his eyes finding hers in the dim light of the bunkhouse. "Certain recent developments have made the idea of settling near Ventura particularly appealing." The weight of his words hung between them, full of unspoken possibility. Before Grace could respond, Josiah stirred on his cot, groaning in pain. The moment passed as they both hurried to attend to their patient. By morning, all 3 injured men were stable enough for Grace to leave them in the care of the ranch's cook, who had experience with basic nursing. Mr. Hargrove himself came to thank her, pressing a generous payment into her hands despite her protests. "My men are worth 10 times this amount, Miss Wilson," the rancher said firmly, and good help is hard to find in these parts." He glanced at Mason, who stood nearby. "Grant here tells me you're establishing a healing practice in Ventura." "Yes, sir, on a small scale for now." Hargrove nodded approvingly. "We need more people with your skills in this country. Too few doctors, and most of them too proud to acknowledge that sometimes the old ways work better than the new." He tipped his hat to her. "You're welcome at the Hargrove Ranch anytime, Miss Wilson." As Thomas prepared the wagon for their return journey, Mason walked Grace outside, away from curious ears. "When will you return to town?" Grace asked. "We've lost at least a week with the stampede and injuries," Mason replied, "but I should be back within a month." He hesitated, then reached for her hand. "May I write to you more frequently? These past weeks without seeing you have been longer than I expected." Grace felt the warmth of his calloused hand around hers, so different from the suspicious stares she had grown accustomed to receiving from men. "I'd like that very much," she admitted softly. Mason's smile deepened. "Then I'll make sure you receive a letter every week until I return." He glanced toward the wagon, where Thomas was politely pretending not to watch them. "Safe journey back to Ventura, Grace." "Be careful with the cattle," she replied, reluctantly withdrawing her hand. "And don't overuse that arm. The wound may be healed, but the muscles need time to strengthen." His eyes crinkled with amusement. "Still my healer, even now." "Always," Grace said, the word carrying more weight than she had intended. As the wagon pulled away from the Hargrove Ranch, Grace found herself looking back, watching Mason's figure grow smaller in the distance. For the first time since leaving Redwater, she felt not just acceptance, but the possibility of something more, a future where her skills were valued and her heart might find a home. True to his word, Mason's letters arrived weekly. Each one revealed more of the man behind the words: his humor, his thoughtfulness, his steadily growing feelings for her. Grace found herself watching for the mail coach with an eagerness that made Helen smile knowingly but refrain from comment. Grace's practice continued to expand. Word of her successful treatment of the injured cowboys spread throughout the surrounding ranches, bringing more patients to her door. Even Dr. Phillips eventually proposed an arrangement whereby she would prepare herbal remedies for his practice, with proper compensation for her knowledge and materials. By the time Mason's cattle drive returned to Ventura 6 weeks later, Grace had established herself as a respected healer in the community. She had saved enough money to rent a small storefront on a side street off the main thoroughfare, where she planned to open an apothecary selling her remedies and offering treatment for those who couldn't afford the doctor's fees. When Mason finally appeared at the boarding house door, clean-shaven and dressed in his best clothes rather than trail-worn gear, Grace's heart skipped at the sight of him. Helen tactfully made herself scarce as Grace invited him into the sitting room. "You look well," Grace said, suddenly shy despite their months of correspondence. "As do you." Mason's eyes took in the healthy color in her cheeks, the confidence in her posture that had been absent when they first met. "Ventura agrees with you." "It does," Grace smiled. "I've found a small shop to rent. I'm going to open an apothecary next month." Mason's face lit with genuine pleasure. "That's wonderful news. I knew you'd make your place here." He hesitated, then added, "I've accepted Mr. Hargrove's offer to become his foreman, so you'll be staying." Grace couldn't keep the hopeful note from her voice. "I will." Mason moved a step closer to her. "Grace, these past months of writing to you, of thinking about you, they've meant more to me than I can properly express." Grace felt her pulse quicken. "They've meant a great deal to me as well." Mason took her hand gently in his. "When I first came to your cabin in Redwater, I was a desperate man seeking help. I never expected to find someone who would change how I see the world." His thumb traced small circles on her palm. "I know it may be too soon, but I wanted you to know that my decision to stay was largely because of you." Grace looked up into his earnest face, seeing the man who had defended her to strangers, who had valued her knowledge when others feared it, who had shared his thoughts and dreams with her across the miles. "It's not too soon," she said softly. Not when it feels so right. Mason's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Then, Miss Wilson, would you do me the honor of allowing me to court you properly? With Helen and Thomas as chaperones, of course, to protect your reputation. Grace laughed, joy bubbling up inside her. Mr. Grant, I would like nothing better. The courtship that followed was both proper and passionate in its own quiet way. Mason called on Grace twice weekly, taking her for walks through town, helping her prepare her new shop, and occasionally escorting her to church socials and town gatherings. Helen and Thomas watched over the developing relationship with benevolent approval, providing appropriate supervision while giving the couple space to know each other better. Mason proved himself to be not just a capable cowboy, but a man of unexpected depths. He helped Grace build shelves for her apothecary, showed surprising knowledge of carpentry, and revealed a talent for figures that served him well in his new position as ranch foreman. He treated her work with respect, often bringing her unusual plants he encountered on his rides through the surrounding countryside. For her part, Grace blossomed in Ventura. Her apothecary, which she named Wilson's Remedies, quickly became a respected establishment in town. Even Pastor Wallace eventually softened toward her after she successfully treated his daughter's persistent cough when other remedies had failed. 3 months into their courtship, Mason brought Grace to a hilltop overlooking the valley at sunset. The autumn colors painted the landscape in golds and reds, the town of Ventura nestled peacefully below them. I brought you here for a reason, Mason said as they sat on a blanket he had spread on the grass. This is the view that convinced me to stay. Grace looked out over the beautiful vista. I can see why. It's breathtaking. Not as breathtaking as you, Mason turned to face her fully. Grace, when I rode into Redwater that night, bleeding and desperate, I had no idea I was riding toward my future. Every day since then, I've grown more certain that meeting you was the most fortunate moment of my life. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. Grace's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a delicate gold ring with a small emerald stone. I chose the emerald because it reminded me of your eyes, Mason said softly, and because green is the color of healing, of growth, of life. He took her hand. Grace Wilson, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Tears welled in Grace's eyes as she looked at the man before her, strong yet gentle, respectful of her independence yet protective of her safety, admiring of her knowledge rather than fearful of it. Yes, she whispered, then more firmly, yes, Mason, I will marry you. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Mason's smile was radiant. I promise to stand beside you, not in front of you. Your gift of healing is too important to be diminished by marriage. And I promise to share that gift with you and with our family, should we be so blessed, Grace replied, her heart fuller than she had ever thought possible. Their kiss, bathed in the golden light of sunset, sealed promises both spoken and unspoken of respect, of partnership, of a love born in unlikely circumstances and strengthened through shared values and mutual admiration. They were married in the spring of 1879, when the wildflowers Grace so loved carpeted the hills around Ventura. The ceremony took place in the town church, with Pastor Wallace officiating, a fact that still amazed Grace, considering his initial suspicion of her. Helen stood as her matron of honor, while Mr. Hargrove served as Mason's best man. The wedding was well attended, with townspeople, patients, and ranch hands filling the pews. Even Dr. Phillips came, presenting the couple with a magnificent illustrated medical encyclopedia as a wedding gift, a tacit acknowledgement of Grace's professional standing that meant more to her than any more conventional present could have. After the ceremony, Mason surprised Grace by leading her not to the small house they had rented in town, but to a wagon decorated with flowers. I have something to show you, he said, helping her up to the seat beside him. Your wedding gift. He drove them several miles outside of town, following the river upstream until they came to a small homestead nestled against the foothills. A tidy cabin stood amid newly planted trees, with a large garden plot freshly turned for spring planting. "Mason," Grace breathed, taking in the scene. "What is this?" "Our home," he said, his voice warm with pride. "If you approve. Mr. Hargrove sold me 40 acres as part of my compensation. I've been working on the cabin every spare moment for months." Grace climbed down from the wagon, stunned by the gift. "But my shop in town is still yours to run as you see fit," Mason assured her. "It's an hour's ride to town, easily managed several days a week, but here," he gestured to the surrounding land, "here you can grow all the medicinal plants you need. There's a spring-fed creek just beyond those trees, perfect for water-loving herbs. The soil is rich, and I've fenced 2 acres specially for your garden." Grace walked slowly toward the cabin, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift. Mason had created not just a home but a place where her work could flourish. "Come inside," he urged, taking her hand. "There's more." The cabin interior was simple but beautiful, with polished wood floors and ample windows to let in natural light. A stone fireplace anchored one wall, and practical, well-crafted furniture filled the main room. But it was the second, smaller room that brought tears to Grace's eyes. Mason had built her a workroom, with shelves for her bottles and jars, a large table for preparing remedies, and a special cabinet with dozens of small drawers for storing herbs and ingredients. "How did you know?" she asked, running her fingers over the smooth wood of the work table. "I paid attention," Mason said simply. "Every time you mentioned something you wished for in your practice, I made note of it." He smiled a little sheepishly. "I also may have consulted Helen about the details." Grace turned to him, her heart so full she could hardly speak. "It's perfect." "All of it, I never dreamed." Mason pulled her gently into his arms. "You dreamed of acceptance, of using your gift without fear. I just wanted to give you the space to make those dreams real." Their kiss sealed a promise greater than any wedding vow, the promise of a partnership built on mutual respect and understanding, where each supported the other's purpose in the world. That night, as husband and wife, they discovered a different kind of healing in each other's arms, the healing that comes from being fully known and fully loved, without reservation or fear. In the years that followed, Grace and Mason built a life that balanced his work at the Hargrove Ranch with her growing reputation as a healer. She maintained her shop in Ventura 2 days a week, while developing an extensive medicinal garden at their homestead. People soon began making the journey to their cabin when they needed her services, particularly for more serious conditions that required ongoing treatment. A year after their wedding, Grace discovered she was expecting their first child. Mason's joy was matched only by his concern for her well-being, though Grace assured him that pregnancy was a natural condition, not an illness. "Besides," she told him with a smile, "I have the advantage of knowing exactly which herbs are safe during pregnancy and which remedies will ease the discomforts." Their son, William Thomas Grant, was born on a crisp autumn day in 1880. With Helen Forrester serving as midwife under Grace's calm direction, a somewhat unusual arrangement that nonetheless resulted in a smooth delivery. Mason paced outside until Helen called him in to meet his son, placing the tiny bundle in his arms with a knowing smile. "He has your eyes," Mason whispered to Grace, awestruck by the perfect little being they had created. "And your chin," Grace replied, exhausted but radiant. "Stubborn already." As William grew, he showed a natural curiosity about his mother's work, toddling after her in the garden and watching wide-eyed as she prepared her remedies. By the time he was 5, he could identify many common medicinal plants and solemnly informed visitors that his mama was the best healer in all the territories. In 1882, Dr. Phillips retired, recommending to the town council that they consider subsidizing Grace's practice to ensure Ventura continued to have access to medical care. After some debate, the council agreed, providing a small stipend in exchange for Grace's commitment to treat those who couldn't afford to pay. It was a remarkable validation of how far she had come from the frightened woman who had fled Redwater under suspicion of witchcraft. Their daughter, Emma Rose, arrived in the spring of 1883, with her father's dark hair and her mother's gentle touch with plants and animals alike. The children grew up surrounded by nature and nurture in equal measure, learning both practical skills from their father and healing arts from their mother. Mason's position at the Hargrove Ranch evolved over the years. When old Mr. Hargrove passed away in 1885, his son offered Mason a partnership in the ranch operations, recognizing his value not just as a foreman but as a business manager. The arrangement allowed the Grant family to expand their homestead, building a larger house to accommodate their growing family and Grace's expanding practice. In 1887, Grace received an unexpected letter that brought her past full circle. Sheriff Holloway wrote to inform her that Redwater had suffered a diphtheria outbreak that had claimed several lives, including that of the town's only doctor. He asked, with formal politeness that couldn't quite mask his desperation, if she would consider returning temporarily to help the town. Grace sat at her work table, the letter trembling slightly in her hands as Mason entered with an armful of freshly cut herbs from the garden. "What is it?" he asked, setting down his harvest and coming to her side. She handed him the letter wordlessly. As he read, his expression darkened. "You don't owe them anything," he said finally. "Not after how they treated you." Grace looked out the window to where William and Emma were playing in the garden, their laughter carrying on the summer breeze. "No, I don't," she agreed. "But there are children there, Mason, families. People who were kind to me like the sheriff." Mason studied her face, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You want to go, I want to help," she corrected gently. "It's who I am. Who you've always supported me in being," he nodded slowly. "Then we'll go, all of us. The children are old enough to travel, and I won't have you facing that town alone." Grace's heart swelled with love for this man who continued to stand beside her in all things. "Thank you." Their return to Redwater a week later caused a stir in the small mining town. Many faces Grace recognized, though the years had written their passage on features once familiar. Some people crossed the street to avoid her family, while others approached cautiously, desperation for help overcoming their lingering suspicions. Sheriff Holloway, now gray and moving more slowly than Grace remembered, met them at the town's small hotel. "Appreciate you coming, Miss Wilson, Mrs. Grant, I should say." He nodded respectfully to Mason. "Town's been hit hard, 27 cases so far, 8 deaths." Grace set up a treatment space in the hotel's dining room, using the remedies she had brought from Ventura along with local herbs that Mason and William gathered under her direction. For 2 weeks, she worked tirelessly, treating the sick, instructing parents on care procedures, and preparing preventative tonics for those not yet affected. The results spoke for themselves. No new deaths occurred after her arrival, and gradually, the sick began to recover. Even the most suspicious townspeople found it hard to maintain their fear of witchcraft when their children were returning to health under Grace's care. Mrs. Tanner, who had been among the loudest voices calling for Grace's expulsion years earlier, approached her on their final day in Redwater. The older woman looked smaller somehow, diminished by years and hardship. "My grandson would have died without your help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong about you before. I'm sorry for that." Grace touched the woman's hand gently. "Fear makes us see enemies where there are only differences, Mrs. Tanner. I'm glad I could help your grandson." As they prepared to leave Redwater, Sheriff Holloway presented Grace with an official letter from the town council, thanking her for her service and formally rescinding the unofficial banishment of years past. "Means you can visit whenever you want," the sheriff explained. "Though I expect Ventura's lucky to have you permanently," Grace glanced at Mason, who stood nearby with their children. "My home is with my family," she said simply, "but it's good to know doors remain open." The journey back to Ventura felt like a completion of a circle begun that night when a wounded cowboy had appeared on her porch seeking healing. As they traveled the familiar road, Mason reached across the wagon seat to take her hand. "Proud of you," he said quietly. "Always have been." Grace squeezed his hand, grateful beyond words for the life they had built together, a life where her gift was recognized as exactly that. A gift, not something to be feared or condemned. In the autumn of 1890, 12 years after Grace had fled Redwater under a cloud of suspicion, she stood in the doorway of her expanded clinic, watching as her oldest son carefully labeled bottles of tincture under her supervision. William, now 10, had inherited her steady hands and meticulous nature, along with his father's quiet strength. At the large work table beside him, 8-year-old Emma sorted freshly dried herbs with a natural intuition for which plants belonged together. Their youngest, 3-year-old James, played contentedly on a blanket in the corner, stacking wooden blocks Mason had carved for him. The sound of a horse approaching drew Grace's attention outdoors, where she saw her husband returning from town, his tall figure as straight and strong as the day they'd met. Mason dismounted with the easy grace of a lifelong horseman, his smile warming as he caught sight of her in the doorway. In his hands, he carried a package wrapped in brown paper. "Special delivery from Denver," he announced, kissing her in greeting before presenting the parcel. "Dr. Matthews's new book on botanical medicine. He inscribed it specially for you." Grace accepted the package, still amazed even after all these years that her correspondence with medical professionals throughout the territory had led to such collegial relationships. "Thank you. How was town?" "Busy. The railroad's bringing in new folks every day." Mason lifted James into his arms, the little boy squealing with delight. "Town council asked if you'd consider taking on an apprentice. Seems they're worried about what happens if you get too busy to handle all the medical needs." Grace laughed. "I've already started training one," she said, nodding toward William, "though I suppose he won't be ready for real practice for some years yet." "They were thinking someone older," Mason conceded. "But I told them your family tradition was to pass knowledge down through generations, and they seemed satisfied with that." His eyes held a gentle teasing. "Didn't mention that the Wilson women's tradition now includes Grant men and women too." Grace looked around at their children, William's serious concentration, Emma's intuitive sorting, little James's bright curiosity, and felt a profound sense of rightness. Her grandmother's knowledge would not die with her. It would continue, blended with modern medical understanding, respected rather than feared. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the hills around their home, Mason put his arm around Grace's shoulders. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked. "When I showed up bleeding on your doorstep in Redwater," Grace leaned into his embrace. "Sometimes it seems like another lifetime." "I was delirious with pain and fever," Mason remembered. "Thought I might be hallucinating when I saw you standing there with that revolver." Grace smiled at the memory. "You called me witch that night, and you healed me anyway." Mason kissed her temple gently. "Best decision I ever made, asking a suspected witch to save my arm." "Best decision I ever made was saying yes when you offered to accompany me to Ventura." Grace turned in his arms to look at him directly. "Even with all the healing I've done over the years, nothing has mended my heart like your love, Mason Grant." "Then we've healed each other," Mason said softly. "And that's the most powerful magic of all." As the last light faded from the sky, they remained together on the porch, surrounded by the life they had built from unlikely beginnings, a life where knowledge was respected, differences celebrated, and love allowed to flourish in the open, as natural and necessary as the healing plants in Grace's garden. The whispers of witch had long since faded, replaced by murmurs of respect and gratitude. In finding each other, Grace and Mason had discovered a truth more powerful than fear. That love, like healing, required both knowledge and faith, both science and mystery, both careful tending and wild, unpredictable growth. And in that balanced wisdom, they had found their true home.